Hey guys, Unseen Hero here, and I'm bringing you guys a Pokemon X and Y Wi-Fi battle against Reid. He's one of my friends, and so let's just get down to the team analysis. My team is pretty basic. I'm running the Scarf Flygon, the Life Orb Hone Claws Durant, the Physically Defensive Weezing, the Life Orb Gardevoir, and obviously the best Pokemon in existence, Arcanine, named after me, Jacka, in my in-game character, and my especially defensive Umbreon. Taking a look at Reid's team here, we can see that he carries the Greninja, which is kind of a big threat since Greninja can learn a lot of moves and it can have a lot of super effective type moves against my Pokemon, so I had to watch out for that. We can see the Mawile, which is obviously the Mega Mawile, which is really threatening if you don't know how to deal with it. I skip over the Tentacruel and Trevenant because they aren't too threatening to my team, and the Gliscor and Ferrothorn can be a problem, but I do have an ace up my sleeve to counter them. I decided to lead off with my Scarf Flygon since I had nothing better to lead off with, and if I do have an unfavorable matchup, I could always just U-turn. My opponent decides to go for the Ferrothorn, and this is bait for my Flamethrower, and I do use the Flamethrower because obviously the attack is obvious, but I just don't want to pass up the chance of getting a free knockout just in case he overpredicted. My Flygon now is locked into Flamethrower, which is abysmal against the Tentacruel, so I decide to switch on to my Durant and hopefully set up something while my opponent goes for Toxic Spikes. I decided to set up with my Hone Claws this turn since I knew my opponent would want to set up a second layer of Toxic Spikes, and I do predict quickly, so I do get a free +1 in accuracy and an attack. I decided to go for the Crunch this turn so I could get some damage off on his Tentacruel, but my opponent switches out into his Gliscor, which proves that he is physically defensive, and my Crunch does approximately a quarter, I'd say. I was expecting my opponent to go for the Protect this turn, so I decided to set up a Hone Claws, but he doesn't go for the Protect and actually goes for the Earthquake, which does around 40%, but it doesn't really matter to me too much since my Durant is now at +2 in attack and accuracy. Now Durant is the ace I was talking about in the team analysis. I knew my opponent would underestimate the power of Durant, so I decided to go for an Iron Head this turn, and it does a lot of damage and makes it to the point where he can't set up a substitute. I should have predicted the Protect this turn since it was quite obvious, but I decided not to and just go for the safe Crunch just in case he switched out or if he didn't go for the Protect. I knew that my opponent wouldn't go for the Protect this turn, so he'd either have to leave his Gliscor in or he'd have to switch on to Pokemon, so I go for the Crunch knowing it's the safest move, and he brings in his Ferrothorn, so I do approximately 40% to his Ferrothorn, and once again he doesn't know that Durant is actually my ace against his Ferrothorn. I go for the X-Scissor this turn knowing it would do more than the Crunch, and it's able to knock out this Ferrothorn, which is great for me, so that's one physically defensive all out, but he brings in his Greninja. I thought my Durant would be able to take an attack from this Greninja, either the Scald or the Ice Beam. My opponent actually reveals the hidden power of Fire, which is easily able to knock out my Durant. So now I have to decide who to switch, and I decided to use my Gardevoir so I could get off the Trace and actually copy my opponent's Protein. I am not too sure why, but this turn I decided to go for the Shadow Ball, while my opponent switches out to his Tentacruel, which is especially defensive, but as you can see it still does a good chunk to this Tentacruel. Now this turn could be kind of unfair, because this battle did happen in real life while we were there and we had some friends around, and we had a friend in the background saying, "Oh, are you going to fear the Psyshock or the Psychic?" So I don't know if that affected his play, but he switches out into the Greninja, I guess expecting the Psychic type move, but I go for the Thunderbolt since it is safer and it is able to knock out the Greninja, which is the biggest threat he had for my team, but now that's out of here and he decides to bring in his Mawile. Obviously this turn my opponent Mega Evolves since there's no other reason to use a Mawile, but for some reason I wasn't expecting the Sucker Punch, which was kind of blatantly obvious, but I didn't expect it and he's able to knock out my Gardevoir, and I decided to bring in my Jacka or the Arcanine or the best Pokemon in existence so I could get off and Intimidate. Now the Flare Blitz was really obvious, but it was my best move to go for since it would hit his team pretty hard anyways if he did switch out, and he decides to go in his Tentacruel, and as you can see he still takes a heap of damage, and I do get that lucky 10% burn chance, which doesn't really change the battle, but it's still unlucky for him. Now I have the same situation as before where if I go for the Flare Blitz, it's either the Pokemon that he has out is going to faint or the Pokemon that he brings in is going to take a severe amount of damage. My opponent decides to stay in with his Tentacruel since I guess he has no more use for it, and decides to bring in his Gliscor to face off against my Arcanine, which is the best Pokemon in existence. I knew a Flare Blitz would be able to take out a Gliscor from this range, and I just decided to stay in and go for it while my opponent goes for a Protect so he can gain some health from his Poison Heal and also Toxic Stall me a little bit more. Here I was skeptical if the Flare Blitz would be able to take out the Gliscor, but I do go for it anyways, and luckily for me it is able to knock him out, but after a Flare Blitz damage and the poison damage, my Arcanine does have to go down this turn. I knew that my opponent's last two Pokemon were the Mawile and the Trevenant, so I decided to bring in my Weezing because it is physically defensive, thus it could deal with the Mawile, and it does have access to Sludge Bomb, which could take down the Trevenant. My opponent decides to switch on to his Mawile, which is a smart play since it is his hardest hitting Pokemon. I was pushing my luck here. I knew that his Mawile was his last chance, so he tried to set up the best he could. So I knew he'd set up a Swords Dance, and I decided to go for the Infestation, not for the damage per se, but just so that he wouldn't be able to switch out. I don't know why, but Reid decides to go for the Fire Fang this turn, which is not able to knock out my Weezing, while I go for the Destiny Bond. Now since he is infested, he can't switch out, so it's either he stalls out the Infestation, which will make him take some residual damage, or he knocks me out, in effect knocking himself out. My opponent goes for the better option of the two, as Mawile is his last chance, so he starts to set up some more Swords Dances, and I just spam Destiny Bond. Because I don't carry the Will-O-Wisp on this Weezing. I actually have the Sludge Bomb, the Pain Split, the Infestation, and the Destiny Bond. But it would have helped greatly, since now we're just stalling a little bit, and that's pretty much all that's happening for this little time. I went for the Infestation this turn because I forgot that it tells you at the end of the turn that the Infestation is gone, so I just assumed that it was gone. And I'm pretty sure at this range my Weezing would have died to any attack coming off this Mawile. My opponent actually decides to switch out into his Trevenant, which for me doesn't really bother me since now his Mawile is reset back to 0, and I just go for the Destiny Bond just to play it safe. I predicted my opponent to go for a Leech Seed or some other move other than Substitute, so I decided to go for the Infestation for the residual damage, but he goes for a Substitute, and unfortunately Infestation does not hit through Substitute. Now that my opponent's behind a Substitute, he decides to set up the Curse, so I take a quarter of my health every turn, and I knew that a Sludge Bomb would be able to break the Substitute, so I just go ahead and use the Sludge Bomb. He is able to get that Citrus Berry Harvest back, which does come helpful the next turn when he does the Substitute and he gets back his health, but I knew that my Sludge Bombs would be able to break his Substitutes without a problem, so at this point it's just a waiting game to see what happens towards the end. This turn the Curse will bring me down to a very low amount of HP, and my opponent decides to take advantage of this and goes for the Shadow Claw, but unfortunately he's not able to knock me out and my Sludge Bomb does take him down. But since Curse does stay in effect even after the Pokemon he used it is knocked out, my Weezing is knocked out as well. I knew that my opponent's last Pokemon was a Mawile, and in my mind my Flygon would be the best match against it. This turn I misplayed and I should have just gone for the Earthquake since it does have a higher base power. It does get stabbed from Flygon and it is super effective against Mawile, but the Flamethrower is not able to take out the Mawile, it just shows how bulky it is. So he's able to get a Play Rough to bring down my Flygon, and I decide to switch in my Umbreon to face off against the Mawile. At this range of HP I knew that any attack would bring down his Mawile, so my opponent goes for the Sucker Punch knowing he wouldn't be able to outspeed my Umbreon, but unfortunately he is not able to knock out my Umbreon since it is a defensive beast, and I go for the Dark Pulse to take over the game. Anyways, that was a great match. Thank you, Reid. I don't know if you're ever going to watch this, but that was really close, really down to the wire. Hope you guys enjoyed. Unseen Hero here, signing off. Peace.